Welcome again, and thank you very much for your visit to your channel Transmission Lines Engineering TV. This is the second video of this series named Wiring the World. This time we're going to talk about the electrical development of Europe. The case of Europe is very different and more complex than North America, since it is a region composed of several countries that operate under a unified economical zone. Perhaps one of the events which inspired the electrification in Europe was the International Electricity Exhibition in Frankfurt, Germany in 1891. In this year, Germany had a long-distance transmission system of about 175 kilometers from power plants on the Neckar River in the town of Laufen am Neckar and transporting electricity to the city of Frankfurt. Later, in the early 20th century, the Rhine River was a huge source of water for the construction of hydroelectric power plants, and with it, the production of electric power and its transmission went beyond the borders, supplying countries like Germany, France, Belgium, and Switzerland, which Germany was the main producer. By 1906, Germany built a transmission line from its hydroelectric plant in Rheinfelden to the population of Guebwiller in France, which operated at 40 kV with a length of about 70 kilometers. There were other projects starting in 1910 involving 23 and 55 kV lines that transmitted electricity from Switzerland to northern Italy. The Scandinavian countries also participated in the electrification of Europe because during the First World War, one of the first submarine transmission lines was installed from Helsingborg, Denmark to Helsingborg in Sweden with a length of about 8 kilometers. Europe applied the model of alternating current proposed by Nikola Tesla, being Germany its main driver. However, due to the war, Europe had to open its doors to foreign investment, especially from the United States to companies such as Westinghouse and General Electric, who had to compete with the German companies AEG and Siemens. These companies were the ones that dominated the electrical industry in Europe from 1880 to 1940. From 1920, the three-phase 50 Hz system became the standard model for the generation and transmission of electric power in Western Europe. Shortly after, this model was adopted and promoted to electrify other regions of Europe, such as Portugal, Luxembourg, Belgium, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Europe had a vision of implementing a regulation in the development and operation of the interconnected systems in that continent, and in 1920, the international organization, better known as SIGRE, was founded. Since 1929, the French engineer Georges Fiel proposed to the European Union great plans to establish transmission lines long enough to have an interconnected system throughout Europe and support the European countries with each other. And to accomplish this, it was suggested to build lines in 400 kV which could transmit up to 1,000 kilometers without having large losses. But in 1930, another character became key to implement the final plan for the unification of the electrical systems in Europe. Ernest Schunholzer, who promoted the generation based on hydroelectric plants and not on carbon basis, who saw the main cities connected, in particular London, Berlin, Paris, and Vienna. This project was designed to transmit to the impressive 660 kV in that time. Just imagine the power at that time. Years later, in 1937, peace in Europe was threatened by the arrival of Adolf Hitler to the power in Germany. In the days before the Second World War, European countries began to take measurements to the protection of their electrical infrastructures by writing the army to their care. The French engineer Pierre Eilert argued that the electrical sector will become a key piece to sustain the countries and their armies before and even more during the war. A defense program was proposed in the northeastern part of France, where the hydroelectric plants in that area were threatened by possible German attacks. Later, in 1943, Germany took the same precautionary measurements by placing troops on its transmission lines from Germany to France. Meanwhile, in the Mussolini's Italy, it was detected that the electrical industry will be very necessary to produce the necessary armament for the war. To face this threat, Italy invested in the construction of hydroelectric projects, especially in northern Italy, as it was the port of entry of the German troops and must have sufficient power supply to withstand Hitler's attack. In 1944, Italy energized another transmission line in 230 kV from Florence to Verona, and in this way support the northern part of Italy. Since 1936, the Hitler's regime implemented a plan with the aim that Germany become a country whose electricity supply does not depend on other nations, but on the internal resources of Germany. Due to this need, Germany was in an overcapacity, but the need to boost the war industry, soon this overcapacity turned to be a deficit, so the German systems expanded to make self-sufficient Germany not only in the electrical sector and military, but in all sectors in fact. It was the Second World War that boosted the infrastructures in Europe, as the German regime of Hitler boosted the electrification of regions from Austria, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Croatia. Inclusive, the German occupation in Norway resulted in the importation of electric power from Norway to Germany. Since 1934, German infrastructures, including tests simulating aerial attacks by placing explosive charges on the transmission towers. France, during the war, was used to blackouts because the electric service was rationalized, but the devastating bombings damaged the systems because these became military targets in 1943. By 1944, the French electrical system was practically useless, and it was worse when the Allies attacked the German troops in Normandy, better known as the D-Day. Finally, in the post-war period, Europe accepted the intervention of the United States for the reconstruction of the European electrical systems. However, Europe was divided into two sectors, East and West. The western zone of Europe, in charge of the alliance between the United States, Great Britain, and France, had a great impulse to its infrastructures, while the east side, controlled by the Soviet Union, was in serious problems to rebuild its infrastructures. It was in the post-war period from 1947 to 1948 that another chapter emerged in the Europe of mid-20th century that marked the importance of electrical systems for our development as a human race. The beginning of the Cold War translated in the birth of the space race and sealed with the rise of the Berlin Wall. As can be seen, the history of the European electrical systems is full of complexity due to its political and ideological differences of that time, but at the same time, it is full of high technological development, product of the needs of the war. In the next chapter, we will talk about the development of the Soviet Union, so I hope to have the privilege of your company for the next video. Transmission Lines Engineering TV, training to power the war.